Die Diaspora spricht.
La diaspora parla.
Diaspora äänessä.
Diaspora spricht.
Diaspora aan het woord.
Diaspora is speaking.
Përshëndetje, my name is Rina Limoni and I'm the host of Diaspora Speaking. In this episode, I'm joined by Dr. Chloe Fagan, where we will be discussing Kosovar-Albanian literature in the German-speaking space. Welcome to Diaspora Speaking, Chloe.
Thank you for having me, Rina.
As you might have heard, we start the conversation with 3 questions. Where are you from? Where did you grow up? And what do you do in your day-to-day?
I'm from Dublin in Ireland, and I grew up in Dublin as well. I haven't moved abroad. I spent 1 year doing Erasmus, but I don't think that counts as a migrant experience. That was a year in Germany. And now I divide my time between Dublin and Meath, and I work for the Goethe-Institut Irland.
The reason why we're having this conversation today is what you have studied, and that is Albanian Kosovar literature in the German language. My first question, what inspired you to focus on Albanian and Kosovar authors within German language literature?
So I did my bachelor's in German and English in Trinity College in Dublin. And when I majored in German in my bachelor's, and when I finished, I went into work, so the Goethe-Institut in Irland. But then I did know I wanted to continue studying. So I decided that I wanted to pursue a PhD. I did that part-time. And my supervisor for my undergrad is a man called Professor Maury McGowan. He is an expert in Turkish-German literature. And so I had started reading into the area of Turkish-German literature due to him. But he did advise me, if I was interested in looking at migrant literature, that Turkish-German literature has been done, because that is unfortunately the aspect of academia that you need to carve out your own specific niche for yourself. It is not only about what your interests are. And so I went and looked for something different in the area of migrant literature, which was what led me to looking at the Adalbert von Chamisso Prize. So this is a prize that is awarded, or was awarded rather, I don't believe it exists any longer, but it was awarded to those writing in German. It's not their native language, and it is quite broad. You don't have to be living in a German-speaking country in order to enter. It doesn't have to engage with themes of migration. Simply be written in German is the requirement for the text, and it is not your first language. And I saw that in 2012 and 2013, I believe, respectively, 2 Albanian authors had won this prize, which struck me as interesting, and it had not been mentioned anywhere. So that is Ilir Ferra and Ilir Wilms. And that formed the basis of my research. I saw that it was not being written about, and I thought, well, can we examine how Albania and Kosovo appear in German language literature, and what can that tell us about this area of so-called migrant literature, intercultural literature, and also about the position of these diasporas in those countries.
You're mentioning the Turkish diaspora, and I think it's very important to mention that despite everything, and perhaps something that mirrors in your research, is that the Turkish experience provides the starting point of articulating the immigrant experience within German-speaking countries. So to move then the image of Albanians in contemporary German literature, how is it viewed by Albanians and by Austrians? Can you explain the concept of the southeastern turn and how it expands upon the previously established eastern turn in German language literature?
I might take the second part of the question first, because you mentioned about the Turkish migrants coming to Germany. So that is, as you say, how that literature starts. So you have quite a long history of migrant literature in Germany. So it starts in the late 1950s with the arrival of the Gastarbeiter, so the guest workers in Germany coming from Turkey, Greece, Yugoslavia, Spain, Italy, Portugal, and this continues on until the Anwerberstopp. So the stop on allowing workers to come, so foreign so-called workers to come. And most of the initial writing was from Turkish groups, where they found their way together in writing groups to agitate for workers' rights. So it's connected to workers' literature, which was where that initially came from. And then this moves along to other kinds of literature, Betroffenheitsliteratur, where it's like we are going to connect with other I'm slipping into German and English. It's an interesting place to be where words in English are not available to me right now.
Don't worry,
Disadvantaged, we
this
will
is the
say.
place to
That's the
do
word.
it.
We'll see how many languages we can fit in by the end. So between disadvantaged, shall we say, other parts of society and where those commonalities are. And then you move into the intercultural literature, which is sort of where we start to see the Eastern turn, which is what Bridget Haynes is discussing, which is specifically after the fall of the wall, the Iron Curtain, and the opening up of Europe to these other perspectives. So she says it focuses very much on the alienating experience of migration westward for these Eastern European and Yugoslavian authors, as well as examining lived experience of late stage communism. And then with Austria, it is slightly different. It comes a lot later, this migrant literature. It's not that the migrants come much later, it's that the literature comes much later. And they don't organize in the same way. So community is very important. You can see in this different development in Germany, they had community where they could agitate. They've been there for longer. They've been there for 15 years when the Anwerbestopp came around. Whereas in Austria, it was only 5 years. They did not have those connections. So the literature really only starts to come up in the 90s, which is with the Yugoslav succession wars, and then the resulting refugee culture towards Austria. And then, unfortunately, the resulting xenophobia in Austria, which comes from this. And then people organize themselves and begin to write of their experiences and want to write themselves into society. The southeastern turn, I also have to admit, is again me trying to carve out my niche as an academic. So this is part of reflecting on my role as an academic. Do I need to call it the southeastern turn? No, but it sounds very good for the title of my PhD and convincing someone to take it on as a project. But it does also include the Albanian and Kosovar authors, which we did not really see being included in the Eastern turn up until this point. So it is a legitimate idea that I came up with, but also to say that it did not necessarily need to be called that. So it serves two functions.
So at the core, then, you speak about the representation of Albania and Kosovo in some way by diasporic and non-diasporic authors. And this, of course, then how it is researched in academia or in literary sense is that it fundamentally portrays different ontologies of place, memory, identity, and then how this is shaped by space itself, a particular space, and existential conditions. So my next question would be then, how does the work of these authors complicate or contest the official national narratives of Albania and Kosovo? Would you say that due to the different histories of Kosovo and Albania, there are traceable Albanianisms in this literature?
I think, again, it seems to be my strategy. I'm going to take the second part of that question first. I can't answer that. I am Irish. I may be studying this area and I have reached a certain level of proficiency with the language, but I do not have the requisite familiarity to be able to state whether something has noticeable Albanian traits as opposed to Kosovar traits. And that's important to have voices from those countries, from those diasporas to come here and take over those questions. Any answer I could provide to that, I would have to rely on the work from the people who are representing those areas. That would be the only way I could give an answer to that one, a valid answer, I would say, a useful answer. And the one about the idea of sort of a counter discourse is very interesting because it does again come out of the origins of the Gastarbeiterliteratur, the Betroffenheitsliteratur, because that in itself was a counter discourse already to Germany. So these were people who were saying, we are here, we want to take part in the society that we are in and contributing to. We want to take part politically in the society that we're in and we're contributing to. And then there is also an idea of a counter discourse to the country that they have come from, because they are now in a different place and they are writing in a different language. So not all diaspora authors choose to write in German that I have studied. A lot of them do, which is an interesting choice because it is a choice. They could choose to write in Albanian or they could choose to write in German, and a lot of them choose to write in German. And so from that moment forth, the person being addressed is not the homeland, which is in a sense different to if they chose to write in Albanian, that would be more directly addressing the homeland. And then, of course, writing in German, to me, that means it's immediately part of the national literature. This is now German literature. This is now Austrian literature. It is being written in this language, and it is being written in this country, the receiving country. And it means then that these people can write about the traumas that have migrated them into this German-speaking area. The kind of discourse becomes particularly interesting in another area. I have also looked at Serbian authors who are writing in German. So this means you quite often get authors who would be writing in things that would go against many national mythologies that you would have in Serbia. So, for example, there is a Serbian author called Victoria Kuchman, and she wrote a short novel called Ein Stück gebrannte Erde, so a piece of burnt earth. And it is about a Serbian woman in Vienna and her Albanian boyfriend, Kosovar-Albanian boyfriend, and the war is very far away for them, so they do not have to deal with these issues. But then his sister, her boyfriend, is murdered in front of her by Serbian soldiers during the war, and she is raped, and her parents send her to Vienna. And then you see the main character, this Serbian character, having to deal with this, and she begins to understand how nationalism has been constructed, how the media has constructed this intentionally so that specific actors can use this for political ends. And I would imagine it would be quite difficult to publish a novella like this in Serbia. And then you have another author called Marko Dinic, who has written a book called The Good Old Days. So Guten alten Tagen. I probably have that wrong. I'd have to check it. I didn't actually analyze that one as part of my research, but it would also be interesting. It's a Serbian man coming home to Serbia and being very critical of his parents' generation. Particularly for Serbia, it's very interesting to see how it criticizes in a way that might not be possible or would receive a lot of pushback. However, at the same time, for the Albanians and Kosovar authors too, for example, Anila Vims, who I mentioned earlier, she won the Camiso Prize. She wrote a novel, The Oil on the Albanian Streets, which was set in 1924 in Albania, and it is about Fanoli and King Zog and the political struggle there. It's a historical novel, also has a lot to say about colonization, imperialism. But she has mentioned that when she moved to Germany, that was where she had to unlearn Stalinistic interpretations of history. So she said she did not know how to write about history until she left. And then she translated her own book into Albanian because there was a dearth of translators from German into Albanian. And she said her Albanian translation is a lot more critical because she's addressing the Albanian audience and saying we still have not become more critical in how we look at our history and how we look at what we were taught. And so she said it is different when she writes in the two different languages. So back to that idea of like who is being addressed. And then for another Albanian author, there was a memoir. It's a ghostwritten memoir by Ilir Hisku, so who was a singer during the Hoxha regime. And she had a ghostwritten memoir because she came to Germany as a gastarbeiter. So she was a very famous singer during that time in Albania, and unfortunately she was persecuted by the regime and she was subjected to torture and sexual assault by members of the Sigurimi. And she wrote about this in her memoir, and this caused a lot of backlash in Germany. So there was another singer, Sherif Merdani, who upright said that she had invented this just in order to sell more books. And it has not been translated into Albanian. So I would like to know how he came to this conclusion, would be my first question. But it is very interesting to see that it is a male-dominated discourse to this day in Albania. So starting from 1991, when you have the dissolution of communism, it is continuing to be dominated by men. This is not to discount what anyone went through in terms of persecution. It is, however, a very marked difference in how it is received. There's an excellent writer, Shannon Woodcock, who's writing on this area, I recommend, and she talks about that those who had no power at the time of Hoxha, they continue to have no power now, and that it is just always ignored that there is a specific gendered experience that the persecution of women under communism included. So I would say, particularly with Ilir Hisku, it's not necessarily the best book in the world, but she is reclaiming her experience. It's been ghostwritten for her, and it did have more of an effect than most of the other books I have examined because it caused this backlash in Albania from the male-dominated discourse. So I think that's how it can potentially form a counter discourse. I think if it's all right, I actually missed a question there earlier because I got so eager to talk about the other
Not
areas.
at all.
You because I think came in speaking about the images of migrants in German or Austrian literature. I think the best way to sort of give evidence of this would be to take two authors as examples. So you have Ilir Ferra, who's an Albanian-Austrian author, and then you have Andrea Gröll, who was a native, so-called native, what does that mean? Native Austrian writer. And they both deal very explicitly with images of Albanian migrants in Vienna. They're different in the sense of, although the motifs are similar, it is different in that Ilir Ferra has experienced it physically. Like that has been his life. And he relates it to a physical experience in his body, in his biography, whereas Andrea Gröll is critiquing it more from a potentially academic position, but she is aware of the issue of how migrants are perceived and she critiques it. But I think there is that tension of one is far more visceral. So Ilir Ferra, to talk about him briefly, he came from Albania when he was 15 years old to Austria, and he writes about these issues of, he wrote a novel about the final days of the Hoxha regime, Rauchschatten, which is a wonderful novel. It won the Von Commisso Prize. And then he wrote Halber Atem, which was a short story for Zwischen den Kulturen, which is a Austrian prize for a short story, much more stringent in its parameters than the Von Commisso. The Austrian prize, you have to live in Austria and you have to write in the broadest sense about migration or the experience of coming to Austria. So it's really resituating those migrant authors back in their biography, in their country of origin, this idea that migrant literature is limited, which Ilir Ferra really fights against. He's fine with writing about, I have these experiences, but if this is how you use it to market me, I have a very big issue with this. Because he talks about, they edit him in a way that they wouldn't edit a native Austrian. He said that they told him his writing was too complicated and they rewrote it for him. And he said this led him to leaving his publisher. He went to a different publisher because it was just a very strange experience to be told that your German is too complicated for who you are. He talks about, there's reviews of him where it says this man does not look like an Austrian, and people praise how good his German is rather than engaging with what is being written, because his writing is incredibly dense and elusive and it's doing something aesthetically distinctive, but he just keeps being told that was too complicated for what you're writing.
I find amazing how you just did something while you're speaking, something unintentionally, perhaps intentionally, but something that I just wanted to ponder. And you're speaking about collective versus fragmented experiences, both in the Balkan space, diasporic authors may face. And then you're speaking about the same they face in dominating societies such as Germany. You gave two striking examples here. So I want to ponder on this double trauma and perhaps just extend to what you're speaking about already. German literature, like any national literature, is often defined by a dominant cultural narrative. It reflects the values, histories, identities. You just touched on language and the mainstream or majority society. So we just spoke about the canon before we started this conversation. So the canon then tends to favor works by authors who fit into this established image of what it means to be German or Germanist, whether visually, whether in your writing, whether in your in public imagination or national imagination. Traditionally, those culturally rooted in Germany and whose narratives reflect a shared national experience. So the question is, sorry for this long essay, diaspora literature is part of German literature, but in the past 3 decades, is it perceived as such by the dominating society?
I don't know if it is entirely. I think there is an aspect of it where it is consumed as something that is viable on the market. So again, to go back to Ilir Ferra briefly, he wrote his first short story specifically to win the prize. He said, this is not how I write. I'm going to write it so I can win the prize. And he did. He wrote it to win the prize and he won the prize. So this is this sort of capitalist method then that it is included because it can be marketed. We can say that this is migrant literature, it's a specific area, and then we can market it. And then, of course, that brings with it these strictures of what is migrant literature, who is a migrant, what are the experiences that we are allowed to include in this. It becomes a product. But once it's something that's not marketable, once it becomes this, as I said, either a counter discourse in the country of origin or the counter discourse in the receiving country, there's a much more of a refusal. I interviewed Ilir one time, and he said that there is a refusal by a lot of dominating areas in the society to engage with stories of migration that they do not expect, that are not acceptable. And he is very much, we need to engage with stories of migration that are not acceptable to the dominating society. I already said that because they are written in German, to me, that is national literature. It is written in the language, and that is who is being addressed. And it should be seen as part of the national literature because by dint of being here, they are here. They are in Germany, the Albanian and Kosovar diaspora. They're in Austria. That makes them part of this society, which by that definition makes their writing part of the national literature. It is part of German history now, the movement of Gastarbeiter, the way society has changed. Also, what is quite interesting, particularly in the Kosovo diaspora writing in Austria and in Germany, there are these points of resonance found in the recent German history. So quite a lot of engagement from German-speaking side when it comes to the Kosovo War, it reflects on the Nazi past. So a lot of writers will say that that was the resonance, that Germany and Austria, they needed to be involved in this because of what they did in Nazi Germany and in Nazi regime. So that is also part of the national literature. If you see the people who are now residing or who are part of your country, and then you see a resonance to what was the terrible crimes of your recent history, that is also part of the national literature, I would say. And they are dealing with huge themes. You know, they're talking about memory. So what is the memory of your home country or memory of a country you've never been to? It's your parents' country, because that's, of course, another aspect of migrant writing, depending how many generations you go down. But what's more part of national literature than writing about memory? What is more part of national literature than writing about identity? These are the great themes of literature. So I think there might hopefully slowly be a shift. There is, of course, more secondary literature being written about it. So I'm one of them. I'm doing this. And of course, writing secondary literature does grant this sense of legitimacy to something as well. But that brings it again back to this idea of market and capital, that is it only the writing that gets this attention that becomes valuable and is included? So
we're speaking about legitimacy. Of course, the question that comes to mind, especially for someone who is not native to Kosovo, Albania, Serbia, or any other Balkan countries, but who is from Ireland and interested in this field. What interests me is that how do you view your positionality in this research and how you reflect on it?
I'm very critical. So I said earlier, there's a question I couldn't even answer because I just do not possess the requisite knowledge or feel or simply having that understanding for the environment. And as you say, I'm not Albanian, and I think there is an issue with non-Balkan experts in Balkan studies, broadly speaking. There's so many people who say that they are experts in the Balkans who do not speak the language. And I find that very problematic, that if I go into a German degree, I am very explicitly told I cannot look at literature that has been translated from German into English. However, if you want to study the Balkans, that is not a problem. You can study all of this in translation. You are not required to be able to command the language. That seems very strange to me, that there's a standard applied for one and the standard is not applied for the other. And of course, if you don't speak the language of the area you are studying, I mean, that's Edward Said 101, I would say. You are producing an area of knowledge that is very at a remove from the people who you proclaim to be speaking for. And you do need to reflect on your position. You know, I know there's an Austrian expert in the Balkans. He does not speak the language. And particularly coming from Austria, which has a much more colonial position to these countries, you would really want to reflect more critically on these positions. I'm not saying that I do it 100% correctly, because I am the one who got the PhD published, and I did it in a certain way that means I acquired that social capital. So there's other people who from Albania and Kosovo who could have published the PhD and written a much more comprehensive area. I'm the one who got it published, is what I would say, is also the critique of my my positionality. Because the issue of not being able to speak the language, you could be reproducing disinformation. You could be reproducing stereotypes. You're just missing swathes of literature that you don't have access to. For example, I mentioned earlier that there are diaspora writers who do not write in German. So they write in Albanian originally. So there's Atem, who is from Kosovo, and he migrated to Switzerland. He writes in Albanian. Albanian. So if I want to get a broader view of what diaspora literature is, I am going to lose out on that if I cannot access what this author is writing in his language in Switzerland.
Kisha don veç më këty në venin tem Sepse dhe i huaj ish në trahat nuk milet Me një ven me mbaros komplet Ka me kry veç edhe një her shpirti ka me dasht më këty Aty ku jëm rrit, aty ku kom vërtit Aty ku dy fjall anglisht si kom dit Mi than mojnon, pse po kam Se vetin Zunahme Atu pse dy pika loti dëran Me dor, në zemër jem ka thëm se m'ka marmallit për atë ven Edhe një her me bo sherta me ma thirti jam një tem Krejti kisha don në dur Tuja me pushu kur me dor Se m'ki prejk se t'ka vit ma shumë se mu Për që ato je unë në qysh që me ndon Edhe kane, unë e kajt mu qyshe se në ndojnë të qane Po një dit kem nuk thyti nuk hip Se të tutesh edhe pse jo me ty Të ndëgjej sa her që lutesh
Jo mi mosht mu e flat Kosovë nuk përshan Me që nuk se lata Jo shdo me ton kur gjan Eci në porter Se su kanën e i ka her Me ti që mesa tje se lo pak pa dhe një her Jo mi mosht mu e flat Kosovë nuk përshan Me që nuk se lata Jo shdo me ton kur gjan Eci në porter Se su kanën e i ka her Me ti që mesa tje se lo pak pa dhe një her
We know if you're part of Balkan Studies, no one really learns Albanian. I mean, you're one of the few people that I know in Balkan Studies who have made the effort to learn the language. It's a decision, it's a conscious decision, and it reflects something, whether you open a Balkan Studies book or a book on the Balkans, and then sometimes I search for Kosovo and the representation is marginal. Yugoslavia, Kosovo, then is just in the corner. But also, I think beyond the studies, I'm very curious about your journey to learn Albanian. How did it start and how has it developed?
Well, this brings me back to the beginning where you asked me how I came to studying this area. And I gave it is the true answer, is the academic answer of where I found this. There's a more personal aspect to it, which is how this began. So I mentioned that I did an Erasmus year in Germany. And when I was there, I met an Albanian man. And tale as old as time, I was 21 years old and I fell in love. And I obviously wanted to learn more about his country. And in the process of learning about the country and then developing my PhD, I began to learn the language with a teacher who I found in Dublin. We did one-on-one lessons. And as I learned the language, I then uncovered that this man was not actually Albanian. He had, for whatever reasons, been pretending to be Albanian, which I will never know the answers to. Where's the truth? Where's the lie? We'll never know. But it does, I'm not just retelling this story for this is interesting personally, but to come back to that idea of who gets to speak for the Balkans. So for most, I would imagine migrants, or for most people, they would prefer to not be marked in such a way. But this man, very average white man who was not from Albania, he obviously found some sort of exoticization in being Albanian, being special, I don't know. But it was taking someone else's story. I would have to imagine that he took someone's story, which is how he built up this fiction. And that upsets me to think that there was someone out there that he must have spoken to, or where he took this from, a book whose story he took. So that comes back to that idea of non-Balkan experts. They're taking people's stories. They're speaking for other people. And I just think that that's quite problematic. And then it also has to come back to our own ignorance, because if we had a bit more knowledge in general about the countries around us. I mean, Albania is in Europe, Kosovo is in Europe. If we had more knowledge about this, we wouldn't have taken so long to discover this fiction, because we only knew the stereotypes. We only know Liam Neeson. We only know these awful pop culture references. We don't know what Albania is actually like. So he was able to use whatever stereotypes he had to hand, to warn me to not go to Albania on my own, of course, because that would be too dangerous for me, which is very handy for him, of course, to keep me away. And I have been to Albania on my own since then, and I can say that it was totally fine. It was just like anywhere else, and as unique as anywhere else is as well in its own way, but not in the way that he sells the stereotypes. But this is a roundabout way to say that it was learning the language that uncovered this. It was sad in a sense for me too, because obviously this desire to learn the language was born of a desire to be close to someone, to understand them. In a sense, I did become closer and understand them, but it was in a way that destroyed the relationship, because it's very strange to realize someone's pretending to be another nationality their entire time. But what was wonderful is that after I got through this period, because as you can imagine, when you're writing a PhD about Albania and Kosovo and you're learning the language, and then part of the reason for learning it just disappears from the face of the earth, and you feel very disillusioned. I still wrestle with this idea of what Albania and Albanian means to me. It's not a negative thing, but I do have to think about it, that it's so strange that I, in a sense, have been thrown into this language, and you can't undo it. I can't forget Albanian, in a sense. There's no way I can go back, if that makes sense. So I've become part of it. But I had a different experience of learning Albanian to people in diaspora. So particularly, I was older. I began learning this when I was in my mid-20s, and I had the time. I paid for this. I did not have this emotional baggage. But at the time, the emotional baggage came later. But in the sense of, there's a lot of pressure on parents in the diaspora to teach their children the language. And I think it's an unfair pressure, because quite often they are with resources themselves. They are working long hours, multiple jobs. They're trying to learn the language of the receiving country themselves. And then there's this pressure from the homeland for the kids to be able to speak the language. Yes. And then there's that pressure on the children themselves, that if they go back, if they make mistakes, it's going to be commented on. If I make mistakes, it's going to be funny and will be received warmly. Whereas if children from diaspora make mistakes, it's critical. So I just have to say that it's a very different experience for me. It is a lot easier in one sense for me to learn the language.
I find that, I'm going to use this word fascinating, I'm sorry, but in this very dishonest relationship, it's violence, emotional violence, because it must have been discouraging to still go on that. It is perhaps a point in your journey, but you have managed with your work to go beyond that point. I am also curious to know, what are your most humorous moments, comedic moments learning Albanian? Because I have many in English. I still have an accent. I've been living here forever, and I still make mistakes where I'm like, oh God, these people might be laughing in their minds. What are yours?
I have to say, just in general, I think learning another language is one of the most wonderful things you can do. I think the experiences are humbling, I would say, and they make for wonderful stories in the aftermath. I am fearless these days. I think I said this to someone recently, because I've made so many mistakes in German. I've made so many mistakes in Albanian. It is very difficult to embarrass me now. So that is one of the benefits of having learned a foreign language. Nothing is frightening now. But on a more basic level, before the specific examples, my first class was with my teacher, Asida, who I have to give so much thanks and just heartfelt appreciation to. Because if you think about most languages, so major European languages, for example, German, there's an industry around learning German as a foreign language at this point. Asida had to create all the resources herself. So I would go into class with exercises that she had written from scratch. So, it is so different learning a language that is not institutional in that sense. It's not part of an education program. And also it's not as standardized still in many ways, because particularly, there's a very big difference between how Albanian is spoken in Kosovo and how it is spoken in Albania. And it's beautiful and rich. And I absolutely love the refusal to conform, I think, is wonderful. It's just, that is where those distinctions lie, I think. I think I probably appreciate that as someone from Ireland, that language can be distinct in its own way. So our English is distinct in its own way. The alphabet was the first one. I still laugh with Asida to this day of, again, for Kosovo, it's the same. I don't know, what is the difference between ch and ch?
Thank you.
What are you
so
saying?
There is no difference. Thank you.
Oh no, we've had big discussions that it's about where your tongue is placed on the palate, and I've really tried to comprehend that. It's not real. And then, I mean, the structures are so different. I think that's also what's been so just compelling about learning Albanian is that you have a different way of structuring a language and conveying meaning. And I really had to break my head over it for a long time, but your own mind gets reshaped by it too, which is just absolutely fantastic. And I mean, the mistakes though, oh Lord, I don't even know where you start, but it is also wonderful to make mistakes because it just makes the experience more human. You know, you're trying to speak the language and then you end up saying, I wanted to say I was taking medicine. So I think I wanted to say ha ilachin or pi ilachin. I said ha pi and you learn very quickly when you say ha pi to Albanians to not make that mistake again. Then, of course, I was telling a story about a friend who had bought a hammer, and I wanted to say, you know, Chekicha, but I said Kate Seats. And it's just every time it had to have this not safe for work undertone, unfortunately, because then I wanted to say my mother dyes her hair blonde. I did not say that. I said, Mommy, do luinte leishin. Just, and I wanted to say P Barin for some reason. I ended up saying Ha Barin, and Sita's like, I'm getting major flashbacks to living in communism right now, Chloe. It's so. And I mean, like, it has to be said as maybe a final one. I was talking about I wanted to say milk comes in a bottle, like a glass bottle, and I ended up saying, you know, chumash vienna gota. No, Nagoya, I'm a fat. I said Nagoya. Milk comes in your mouth. Like, why did I say this? I don't know. And then, of course, one time I said to someone, I wanted to say I had gaps in my knowledge. I just told them I had holes. I said I had Kamvrima. And just don't go to Albania and tell people Kamvrima. It's just not a great idea. Sorry, should I have warned you?
Oh, no.
But this is the joy of it, is that I had these moments and, you know, people laughed, of course, but it wasn't cruel. It wasn't unkind. You know, people laughed and they said, well, you know, you're trying. So it's become a lovely story. It wasn't like I said this stuff and then it was silent and everyone was embarrassed. It was just this laughter. It was very.
You also said you become fierce, and I totally understand that. You cannot hold anything against me language-wise anymore. Like, I make mistakes, I own them.
I have survived all of this.
But I think we're approaching towards the end. But a question that I did not plan to ask you but I am curious to know, when you visited Kosovo and Albania for the first time, how was your impression formed in literature and then the real touching base with the country itself?
Oh, that was very interesting to me. So the cover of Ilir Ferra's Rauchschatten, this novel that I wrote about, it is of the port in Durrës. And I was not aware of that because I had been reading this book for so long. So, you know, there's the bits of wood, is it, that come out of the sea in sort of different heights. And I was not aware that that's what that picture was. So I just remember coming around the corner, approaching the port in Durrës and going, that's the cover of the book I've been studying for the past however many years. But I think I did feel, it's hard to try and put it into words. I mean, in the idea of I had actually met, you know, Albanians in the diaspora. There's not a huge amount of Albanians in the diaspora in Ireland, not so much as, say, for example, in Germany or in England. But, you know, that was my first contact. And it was just with people who, you know, were willing to put up with my terrible mistakes and spend their time with me and give me coffee. And then that was the same experience I had when I went to Albania, was just incredibly generous people, without making that sound like a stereotype. But it was the case of I went to an Airbnb in Tirana, and it turned out the woman who I was staying with had been an actress in films in communism. And I remember saying it to Asida, and she said, "Oh, Zonia Lula." So this was, I've forgotten her name now, unfortunately, but I only know her now as Zonia Lula. And she sat down with me and we looked at all of her old posters from her films that she had been in when she was working as an actress. And my Albanian was not as good at that point, but I was still able to converse and to understand what was going on here and what she had probably, I mean, only understand in an academic sense. I cannot understand on a personal level what she went through, but I could understand some of the context then. And there was that slight difference, of course, going to Kosovo. And I would have to say I've been to Albania much more than I have been to Kosovo. And when I went to Kosovo, it was February. I had just come from Belgrade, and we arrived in Pristina, and there was a massive protest going on. So I believe this was around the time of before perhaps Vedrandosia got into parliament, and there was a protest on the streets. Mm-hmm. And it was just interesting to experience sort of a place that was still in flux, I suppose is the word, that everything felt very raw, I think is what I would say. And again, these are only my impressions. These are not definitive comments on the area, but there was just a sort of a rawness of what had only recently taken place in the history. But it felt like the people were so, I mean, again, you don't want to use stereotypes, but it was an openness to say, you are here, you are visiting, we are going to talk to you. And then I could talk to them at that point. Still, my Albanian was not as good. I could still talk a little bit, but of course, I do feel like there is some points of identification between Kosovar and Irish people. There's the experience of colonization, experience of occupation, attempting to extinguish the language that people spoke. So I think once I made it clear to people that I was not American, although, they like Americans too, but once I said, I was Irish, there was always a very different reaction of like, you understand. Yes. Even though, I personally have never experienced this in a way, but they felt like they could talk to me, which would be what I would remember from Kosovo, was a sense of they saw people who understood, perhaps. So there is a bridge. Then you said you're going back to Albania on and again, and then you were in Kosovo. So I can imagine, like, when you're dealing with a particular region and when you learn the language, you start understanding cultural subtexts and, I say cultural subtitles. Oh, I like that, cultural subtitles. And there's one question at the end I ask everyone. So if you could bring one thing back from Kosovo, Albania to Ireland, what would it be? Kava. Oh, zot mosma lepa kava. It sounds small, but it's so important to me because, again, when I did my classes with my teacher, Asida, she would always make coffee for me. So she would take out the jezba and she would make this, and then we would sit down and I would struggle with trying not to say insane things in this language, and we would drink our coffee together, and it just became so bound up in learning the language was the coffee. And then she gave me my own jezva and she gave me my own filxhami as well, so I can make it myself. And then she brings me the coffee as well from Albania, so I have my muliri vjeter. Mm-hmm. And to me, it's just really a symbol of having the time to sit down with people, talking, learning. I mean, I can't show you right now, but I actually do have a tattoo of a jezva, and underneath it says Michasi. Love that. Kafe lafen. Yeah. And on this note, thanks so much, Chloe, for being here. Thank you for sharing your knowledge, your experiences with the audience of Diaspora Speaking. It's a pleasure talking to you. Well, thank you so much for having me, Rena. Thanks.